Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I am the host of the Black Brazil Today YouTube channel, as well as the blackbraziltoday.com blog, where I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race. So tonight, I've been away from YouTube for a few days, been kind of sick. Um, it was just best that I take a break, to get a little bit better. I mean, if I had made videos last week, my head was so stuffed up and my voice, there was periods where I was having hiccups, and you could tell that, my voice just wasn't what it usually sounds like. So I just feel like it was a good time to take a break. It was the end of the year. We were moving from Christmas into New Year's. And now that we're into 2023, with recent news that's been coming out of Brazil, it's definitely time for me to get back on my grind. So here I am. So the last few days have brought about quite a turn of events in Brazil. Um, this turn of events started with, I've known for years that generally when there's an election in Brazil, that president will take office on January 1st. So as Lula had won the election over the sitting president, Jair Bolsonaro, a few months ago, we knew that he would take office on January 1st to take his third term as president of the country. Um, we also knew that Brazil was involved in the World Cup of 2022 in Qatar. And, a sign that the team displayed during beginning. I don't know when they actually, displayed this sign, but it was a sign that was sending out love to the great Edson Arantes do Nascimento, better known to the world as Pele. We all know, we've all known, any of us who follow Brazil, live in Brazil, or into Brazilian sports or whatever. We all know that Pele had been sick for a number of years. I've talked about Pele periodically over the history of the blog. There's several pieces you can find on blackbraziltoday.com, the blog, where I discuss Pele and his, my analysis of Pele, the person, the sports superstar, the social figure. And so all of that comes to a point where we have to discuss these things again, because I'm sure, as the world knows by now, that the great Pele passed away a few days ago on December 29th, 2022, as we came to the end of the year. A lot of things come to my mind when I think about Pele. You know, um, I don't, I can't possibly sum up everything that I need to say in one video. As I said, I've discussed Pele in several, Black Brazil Today articles in the past. And similar to how I've had to, in some ways, shift my positions on certain racial topics, I've also had to shift my position on how I saw and how I see Pele to this day. I'm going to discuss a few of those things. Maybe I'll start making a couple of videos, because I think it is important that I share how I feel about Pele. You can't ignore such a globally famous figure, and his life, his career, his years in the public spotlight speaks a lot to the situation of the black athlete. That type of I don't know, that type of dance that the black athlete has to perform in order to, on the one hand, earn as much money as they can, while at the same time adequately represent people who look like them. And that's the same thing we have to deal with Pele. Um, I knew Pele had been ill for the last few years. I remember when I first started seeing him, when he appeared publicly. I don't remember what year that was. It had to been 2 or 3 years ago, where I started seeing him being wheeled around in a wheelchair. And, it's like that with any person that we identify with as we see them move up in years and see the difficulties that they have with their health. And I think it was either last year, the year before, all of these health issues started coming out. And I think it was 2 years ago, he pulled through this operation that he had went through. But this last time that I saw him was, I don't know, month and a half, 2 months ago. I had already, I didn't say this publicly because nobody wants to hear this. And it's not like, I'm trying to wish death on anybody. But I just had the feeling that this time, Pele is not going to make it. The reports that I heard that were coming out of the Albert Einstein Hospital in Sao Paulo, it just wasn't good. And usually when you see public figures that are experiencing health issues and their life could be on the line, generally the press does not report that this person may be on its, taking their last breath. And I totally respect that. That's part of the reason why I considered making another post about Pele while he was in the hospital, because I just kind of knew that he was on his last leg. But I decided not to. I did a couple of posts that focus more on the Black soccer player in Brazil. That's a pretty deep history of which Pele plays an important part. That's something I'm going to have to speak a little bit more in the future, because it's really necessary that we all know what the type of talent that Pele had and how Brazil tried to keep Black people in its place for so long, and to see a Black star make it to the heights of superstardom on a global level. It's a story you can't ignore, whether you like Pele, you don't like him, you don't know much about him. His story and his importance in the sports world in terms of being a sports icon, his story is as important as Muhammad Ali, or any other top sports figure that we know. I mean, you could go online and see that there's debates already. I mean, there's been debates for years. Who are the people that are most important in their sport? Who were most important in terms of being global sports figures? And you'll see people like Muhammad Ali, Michael Jordan, and you can never leave out somebody like Pele. I remember being a kid. When I was a kid, I'm talking 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, I was like a walking sports encyclopedia. I knew the statistics. I knew my favorite players' batting averages. I knew how many home runs they got. I knew the field goal percentages of my favorite basketball players. I knew how many yards the top rusher made, how many touchdowns the top quarterback threw. So, in the United States growing up as a kid, the top three sports that you generally follow were baseball, basketball, and football. And I have to make that asterisk note that says American football, because if you're not familiar, around the rest of the world, football is what Americans call soccer. And this football, what Brazilians call futebol or soccer, it is the most popular sport around the world. It's just not something that really was a really popular sport in the United States. And so when I was a kid and I was sucking in all of these sports statistics and learning about all of these heroes, I remember, I can't say the exact date that I can remember seeing this, but I do distinctly remember when I learned about this person known as Pele. Of course, the Americans pronounced it as Pele. Brazilians pronounce it as Pele. But in the midst of following the Super Bowls and the NBA Finals, which at the time was called the NBA Championship and the World Series, I never forget seeing this. There were always old magazines lying around the house in my home in Detroit. And I just remember seeing this magazine cover of this guy, Pele, on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And I didn't know who he was, but I knew that he was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. This had to have been a big story. It was just something like, apparently this guy was a superstar and now he was playing in the United States. I was fascinated by that, even though I didn't know anything about him. The fact that he was on the cover of Sports Illustrated, he was a Black athlete and he was playing soccer. I'm like, I need to know who this guy is. So that was really my first introduction to Edson Arantes do Nascimento. It would be years later before I would really understand the significance of Pele. And it's only been in the last, I'll say that I've listened when I've done pieces on my blog. It's always been from the racial perspective. And so analyzing things from the racial perspective, I don't necessarily delve really deep into the actual topic of the personality that I'm discussing. And with Pele, it would be soccer, it would be football. But, since he passed away on December 29th, I've just been addicted to watching documentaries and reports about Pele's career and what made him such a colossal figure in global sports. Um, so I'm going to discuss a little bit more about this in the future. I'm going to just go back to an article that I did back in 2014 and then introduce more articles as time goes on, because as I said, even not really knowing soccer, it wasn't a sport that we really followed. It wasn't a sport that we really played growing up in the Black community in Detroit. I only played soccer when I had gym class, and, the gym teacher would have us play soccer. I didn't know the rules. I didn't know how many, people were supposed to be on the field on each team. We just knew you kick the ball and kick it in the net. That's all we knew. I didn't know at that time the intricacies and the details of playing soccer were the same way you draw up plays and you have lineups, defensive arrangements, uh, in American football, you have your lineups in NBA basketball, and you see how baseball players shift depending on who the opposing player is at the plate. All of these intricacies come out in soccer when you start learning about the sport. And it's honestly, even to this day, after living in Sao Paulo for 9 years, some of the time that I lived there, I remember Brazilians didn't understand American football, and this American didn't really understand global football. So we would try to exchange information. But, as I started moving away from sports in the last, say, 10 to 15 years, I'm not into sports anywhere near how I was when I was a kid and even a teenager. And to this day, I still don't really understand soccer that much. It's because of the Brazilian team, the Seleção, the national team, that got me even to watching the World Cup. I don't ever remember watching the World Cup before 2002, which was 2 years after I started doing this deep dive into Brazil. And by coincidence, that World Cup was the last time Brazil won. I could go on forever and ever just talking about my memories, how they relate to Pele, the stories that I remember, the articles that I've read, what other people would say, his image in Brazil, the respect that he receives from the global sports world. It's something that until you really look into it, it's like when you really dig into his career, you come to see this guy. He's on par with Michael Jordan. He's on par with, again, Muhammad Ali. He's on par with some of the top athletes that you probably remember, those greats that are like once in a lifetime. That's somebody like Pele. And as Americans, I feel like in some ways we were deprived of that because, soccer is not such a big sport in the United States. But there's a whole lot to say about that. So right now, I want to get into this piece that I did back in 2014. Social consciousness and the rich Black athlete. Are these conflicting entities the case of Pele? Now, the reason why I felt this was an important piece is because, Pele has been accused for many years, even being a global star, global superstar, being known as the Rei do Futebol, the king of football, the king of soccer, of king of football. There's been a lot of criticism of Pele in his public career. People have asked, like, why has this man never taken a stance on social issues, on racial issues? And it was kind of it was something to watch. When I first started hearing these criticisms, now mind you, when I first started, understanding Brazil back in the early 2000s, Pele was there. He had served a few years as the Minister of Sports under the Fernando Henrique Cardoso administration. I would see him pop up in Brazil's only Black magazine, Raça Brazil, from time to time. Whenever there was a big event, you would see that Pele was there. So he was always. I had this connection with Pele when I was a kid, and then here he is again in the early 2000s when I really started digging into what his country was all about. So this was, a big story when he passed away. So I just, I could go on and on about my memories and maybe the lack of memories, stories that I come to learn years after the average Brazilian knew about them. But this is an important topic because African American athletes going back to the 60s and 70s were always known for their militancy, for speaking out and standing up again for certain issues. Whereas in Brazil, sports is another way of gauging the differences between how America and Brazil deals with the issue of race. And part of that history is one of the reasons why I've had to actually change my position on Pele. I will get into that another time. But for now, this is the piece that I did back in 2014, just analyzing Pele maybe away from the soccer field and just discussing the public figure and the problems that Black social movements had with Pele over the years. So let me just get into this. The legendary talents of the great Pele have rightly earned him the nickname Uhe, meaning the king, and cemented his place in sports history among millions of fans around the world. For soccer fans, he's the equivalent of basketball Michael Jordan, hockey's Wayne Gretzky, baseball's Reggie Jackson, or boxing's Muhammad Ali. So great is King Pele that the International Olympic Committee named him the athlete of the 20th century. Needless to say, according to fans and critics alike, Pele's skills and supremacy on the soccer field or pitch in his prime were unquestionably without equal. Here are just a few pictures of the countless endorsement that Pele made over the years. He remains ever popular in TV commercials today. Now, this article is from 2014. But today's post is not about heaping more praise upon a man who will go down in history as the most celebrated athlete of all time, even if he suddenly disappeared from the public spotlight. No, today's post brings a more critical view of the king on a topic that's not directly connected to his recognized skills as a player. It speaks to the issues that some of his fans have whispered about in regards to the king for a number of years. To touch upon this issue, let's first rewind the clock about 47 years. Again, 47 years from 2014. In 1967, prominent African-American sports figures, Bill Russell, Jim Brown, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar came together in solidarity to show support for boxer Muhammad Ali, who had been stripped of his boxing title because of his refusal to enlist in the U.S. military and consequently participate in the Vietnam War. In supporting Ali and his political stance, these athletes showed that their position as prominent Black public figures in a country in which their racial group faced continuous racist oppression went far beyond the court, field, and ring. Similarly, the pose of the Black Olympic athletes Tommie Smith and John Carlos at the 1968 Olympic Games showed the world that while they represented their country in victory, it also voiced the collective protests of African Americans against their collective social position in the United States. World known, just very historic photo. We all know this picture. I know quite a few people who have this poster hanging on their wall. To get right to the point, where does the great Pele stand on such issues as the blatant acts of racism that are being a continuous part of Brazilian society, that also has presence on soccer fields, as recent events have once shown again? Beyond the adoration of the king on the soccer field, many of his Black fans have pointed out a number of disappointments concerning the beloved Edson Arantes do Nascimento. For starters, although it can be argued that Pele has in fact spoken of the existence of racism in Brazil and on soccer fields, as he did in September of 2001, beyond issuing a few statements on the fact, the king really hasn't gotten involved in the issue. So this is just a headline from September 6th of 2001. That's funny. That's like 5 days before September 11th. Pele denounces racism against Black athletes. Similarly, back in the 1990s, when basketball superstar Michael Jordan was informed of the sweatshops that paid Southeast Asian workers peanuts to make his expensive Air Jordan gym shoes, his airness first stated that it wasn't his problem. But when further pressed on the issue, he said, if it's an issue of slavery or sweatshops, Nike executives have to revise the situation, saying he would even travel to Asia. He never made that trip and went on about earning his millions from that cheap labor. As with Jordan, could it be that in order to earn the fame and fortune that the corporate world had bestowed upon him, the exchange is that Pele remained silent or at least not get too involved with speaking out or denouncing such social ills? This is a picture of Pele's women. Clockwise from top left, this was his first wife. Second wife, girlfriend, Xuxa at the time. Xuxa went on to become a multi-millionaire. Considered one of Brazil's richest women, top television host. The woman he would actually go on to marry, Marcia Aoki, and two of his fans. This was a criticism that many Black women had in Brazil. You never saw him publicly with a Black woman. Pele has also been accused of abandoning the Black community, particularly Black women, with his endless series of relationships with non-Black women. While many will point to his relationship with the blonde media darling Xuxa as an example of his alienation from the Black community, the fact is, Pele has had a number of highly visible relationships with non-Black women. Contrast this with the king's relationship with a maid named Anícia Machado that produced his daughter Sandra. Although Pele only knows the truth of the circumstances of the relationship, for many, the way he distanced himself from that relationship reveals yet another character flaw in the king's character. Sandra Regina Felinto tried for nearly 30 years to secure official recognition from Pele as her father. But it was only in 1996, after a DNA test, that she was able to prove that she was indeed his daughter, after which she would begin using his surname, Nascimento. So this is Sandra Regina with a birth certificate showing Pele as her father. She died some years ago of breast cancer, if I'm not mistaken. I always wondered, why Pele never recognized this woman. If there's a story out there that speaks on Pele's distancing from this woman, or this woman who proved to be his daughter, I haven't come across it yet. The superstar had had an extramarital affair with Anícia Machado, Sandra's mother, but didn't want to assume paternity because of the scandal that a child outside of marriage would cause. I guess we have the answer right there, but I think it might be a little bit more involved there. Sandra died in 2006 from breast cancer, and although Pele finally recognized her, the relationship between the two was never good. Question: by 1996, Pele's career had been over for around 20 years, and his marriage to his first wife over for more than a decade. After avoiding the issue for so many years at that point, why couldn't he simply step forward and acknowledge paternity? In the end, that's all that Sandra, a two-time elected city councilwoman in the city of Santos, and a law student, ever wanted. Now, Santos being the city where Pele gained his fame with the famous Santos Football Club in the city of Santos on the coast of Sao Paulo State. Recently, the aftermath of this relationship will be made public again as Sandras Sons, Gabriel and Otavio, sued the king and demanded 13,500 reais per month in support payments. The lawyer of the young man, Claudio Forcel, accused Pele of never having given any moral or financial assistance to the young men, the young boys, and only having seen them once in his life. In December of last year, the courts ordered the king to pay a monthly pension of 4,746 reais per month each to Gabriel and Otavio. With the recent headline-making events or incidents of racism against Black Brazilian soccer players, Pele's absence has once again come into question. Even Brazil's president at the time, Dilma Rousseff, has stepped forward and offered her solidarity with the players against this ongoing scar on Brazilian society. Although Rousseff's public act of support could be seen as simply symbolic, as a nation's president has so many pressing issues to deal with, it's still important. How is it that Pele, who has been retired for nearly 40 years but remains in the public spotlight as if he were still playing and is still adored by the nation, can be so invisible on an issue which he admits has personally affected him as well? Well, perhaps it is within this very fact that lies the answer. This is a picture of the then president, Dilma Rousseff. She was the first female president of Brazil. She met with the referee Marcio Chagas and the player Chinga at the presidential palace in Brasilia, the nation's capital. The two were recent victims of racist acts in soccer stadiums. You know, the racism against black players, and this time a referee, they were making world headlines, whether black players were experiencing racism in European soccer leagues or in Brazil or in other Latin American countries. This became a really big issue. It's important to point out that, and this is in some ways the reason why I've had to reflect and perhaps change my position on Pele, is that we have to understand that the racial environment in Brazil in 2022 and now 2023 is much different than what it was when Pele was playing. You know, race wasn't something that most Black Brazilians even talked about in Pele's era. Pele was born in 1940. And when you talk to men who were born in Pele's era, they say this like, this wasn't a discussion that they had at home. I've talked about this in several videos where it was just you know, it was a piece of Brazilian society that people just didn't discuss. A lot of Black people tried to avoid being defined as Black. They tried to escape from a Black identity. And so this was just not the era for having a discussion about, you know, racism in a country. In some ways, many people have said that in terms of racial politics, Brazil is 40 to 50 years behind the United States. But we have to understand that the circumstances were in some ways very different, how race played out in Brazil versus, say, in the United States. Again, which is one of the reasons why I've had to reposition myself on the question of Pele. But again, this is a piece that I did in 2014. As some of the other articles that I put up more recently, I've had to explain how there's certain views that I had on Pele that I've had to change at least a little bit. I'll get into that in another video. But still today, in the 21st century, the country continues to have a problem accepting the deeply racist attitudes of everyday Brazilians. As such, a dark-skinned Black public figure that is adored by the public, such as Pele, indeed risks falling out of public favor by discussing such an issue that so many continue to deny, even with the abundance of evidence. Just think about how many non-Black people would be supporters of Michael Jordan if he were in front of the camera talking about race and racism every day. You know, I think that's one thing that comes with the territory. We give you this bag of money, but the flip side is that you're going to have to just remain kind of invisible on social racial issues. That's the trade-off, what it appears to be. I could go much more into that, but I want to focus on this article. It also seems as if Brazil reminds Pele that they accepted him, at least as a sports hero, a man who is a very dark-skinned descendant of Brazil's 350-year history of the enslavement of Black people. In other words, we love you, but don't try to step outside of your place, Negro. Now, again, one could say that Pele reached a height of popularity that very few Brazilians will ever reach. I mean, this is something that I have to point out, is that being a Black American and growing up with an obsession with sports, like most boys of my age bracket, learning about Pele introduced me. He was the first Brazilian I can ever remember. So my first image of a Brazilian was a dark-skinned Black man. Now, when we get more into the history of Afro-Brazilians in sports, we see that that's perhaps not something that the Brazilian government really liked that much. And that's something, as I've said, you know, I've wanted to talk more about this. It's just another one of those topics where I can go really deep into it. Brazilian elites did not like the idea of having Black players representing the country outside of Brazil. You know, the whitening ideology said, we want to present to the rest of the world a very whitened Brazilian. So it goes against the grain when you get a not only just a Black guy, but a dark-skinned Black man ascend to become the most popular, well-known Brazilian around the world. You know, it's kind of funny. There's probably a whole lot written out there about how the Brazilian government dealt with that. Anyway, And yet another recent example of the king refusing to do the right thing. Last January, Pele requested that Brazilians stop their ongoing street protests because they are, quote unquote, ruining the party. The Brazilian uprisings made world headlines last June. Again, this is from 2014, when millions of Brazilians took to the streets in protest against a number of things, including recent public transportation rate increases, political corruption, and the failing healthcare and education systems. Another issue in these protests was that the billions that the Brazilian government was spending to host the 2014 World Cup, when it could have been used on so many other things, and at this time, it was scheduled to begin in less than 100 days. Now, again, this article is from 2014, but if you remember, there were these enormous protests that took millions of Brazilians to the streets in, like, I think it was around 2013. And so people felt that, once again, Pele was on the wrong side of the story. He was trying to really calm down the crowds and tell people to go back home. This is not the time for this. Brazil had won rights to host a World Cup, and he felt like all of these protests that were going on just a year before the cup was supposed to take place was going to ruin the party. In other words, even though Pele has made millions over the course of his public career and continues to rake in money with endorsement deals, he believes that Brazilians should postpone protesting endemic social inequalities, of which the game itself is a glaring example. Never mind the fact that I no longer buy the idea that these protests are purely a thing of the people. The principle of the question remains the same. This was actually the second time the king asked Brazilians to stop the protest. He made similar requests last June in a video posted on YouTube. Now, I just want to point out something what I'm talking about in this last piece right here. I had been in Sao Paulo for about a year when all of those protests went down, and I thought they were legitimate. It wasn't until some years later that I started understanding how these protests seem to be manipulated from behind the scenes. There were several protests that were going on in different countries. If you remember the Occupy Wall Street protest that happened just the year before, all of a sudden, these popular protests would pop up out of nowhere and then just dry up out of nowhere. And one of the main things that I saw that made me think, like, this is kind of a farce. Brazilians were protesting against bus fares going up by like 20 or 30 or 40 centavos or something. And so that led millions of people across the country out in protest. And so when state officials from different states were telling people, okay, we're going to keep the bus rates the same, the situation kind of ended. But then what told me this was kind of a sham, like I said, when I looked behind the scenes and I got some information behind the scene, it just looked like it was very superficially staged to me. And then the fact that a little while after all of those protests, these governments raised the amount of, they raised these bus rates much more than the increase that caused the protest. And there was hardly a peep from the Brazilian population. So I'm like, okay, I don't know how you see that. I'm not basing my whole opinion on those protests just on that one fact. But when you look a little bit more behind the scenes, it's just like, looks like some engineering going on here. Anyway, so this is a video of Pele at the time asking people to stop protesting, right? On the issue in January, the king was quoted as saying, "The country could be filled with tourists receiving all the benefit of these tourists, and the Brazilian himself is spoiling the party." Many people don't understand, because I think that soccer has nothing to do with the corruption of politicians, he said. He continued, "Soccer has always praised Brazil. So if we are going to protest, let's attack the politicians. Let these parties go on and then make our demands. But soccer has nothing to do with this, which worries me a lot. Hopefully, the Brazilian had this consciousness. Let the World Cup go on, and then we'll make demands of what they're stealing," unquote. In these few words, this would be funny if he weren't serious. Let the protests wait. Soccer has nothing to do with this corruption. With soccer being one of the biggest money attractions in Brazil, where does the king think most of this money is going? When I saw the YouTube video back in June, I, like many Brazilians, was disgusted. Was he serious? It was almost embarrassing to watch. The king came across as the folkloric Pai João type. The Pai João cultural figure is similar to like the Uncle Tom figure. Well, how most people believe the Uncle Tom figure is supposed to be in U.S. folkloric history or culture. You know, the passive Negro who just goes along with the program, basically. The king came across as the folkloric Pai João type, being put out front on behest of his master to calm down the rabble. The government and police couldn't calm down the crowd, so they marched out old, good, and faithful Pele. Of course, there's no way to prove this, but I really did wonder if this was really him speaking, or was he simply being a bamboozled puppet being told what to do and say by his string masters? Is there any sense of conscience here? I mean, we know that there are billions to be made in this World Cup, the same event of which musician Gilberto Gil spoke out against in terms of outrageous ticket prices that would put access out of the reach of millions of poor kids, some of whom, like Pele himself, would go on to be the main attractions on the field, bringing in this big money. Wait, is that yet another issue that the king had nothing to say about? I have to wonder how much the king stands to earn from the World Cup being played in Brazil. So understand what's going on here. The musician Gilberto Gil at the time was speaking about there are perhaps millions and millions of Brazilian kids who would love to go see the World Cup that was being hosted in stadiums across Brazil, but they would never be able to afford to be able to make it to, such a, global event. Players like, Pele and numerous other players that come from poor backgrounds, often poor Black kids who rise to the ranks of, the soccer clubs and become global, superstars. Many of them go on to Europe, but these same kids who will go on to represent Brazil in these soccer fields as kids, and kids who are growing up in their shadows would probably never be able to afford to go to, such basically a corporate event. Of course, we remember what happened to Brazil in the 2014 World Cup, but that's another story. What a shame. But let this serve as a reminder for those of us who wish to someday gain fame and fortune, be featured in television commercials, and have our images plastered on ads promoting everything from shampoo and soft drinks to cell phones and $200 gym shoes. To reach this level of success, the price is one's soul. In today's age of multi-million-dollar endorsement deals, the public has largely come to accept the wealth, fame, and success of such public figures to the point that everyone knows the deal. If you play, you will definitely get paid. Perhaps one could argue that people like Mr. Nascimento, Pele, are merely entertainers, and that this social ills, inequality, and injustice is not their battle. In some sense, this is actually true. It's a difficult feat to make money by making people forget society's ills by peddling a dreamlike world in which 99% of them, 99.9% of them, will never manage to achieve. But I do have to wonder if these people ever lose any sleep over such things. So anyway, this is a piece that I did back in 2014. And it's just one side of how we have to analyze how Pele will come to be remembered. I had a friend send me a text message today asking me, this guy, he's actually lives in the state of Minas Gerais, which is where Pele was born. And he sent me a text message from Minas today asking me what my thoughts were on Pele. And as I said before, I can't sum up everything about Pele that comes to mind when I think about him, because there's so many things that I could say. And it's not something I'm going to try and cover in one article, but this is the first piece of probably several that I'm going to get into, as the king has recently passed away. So that's just one article. As I said at the top of this piece, I've had to change my position on Pele, but to show where I once was on Pele and where I'm standing now, I just wanted to go back and discuss, some of the topics, some of the controversies surrounding Pele, you know, at the time of this article when I put it up in 2014. So if you like this article, definitely give me a thumbs up, like this video, share this video, consider subscribing to the channel, and push the notification button so you'll be one of the first to receive my videos as they go up. So with that said, I'm going to end this video here, and hope to see you guys follow me for the next one.